I died during the Middle East War, and what I saw in hell before returning changed everything. There is a sound that no one who has been to war can ever forget. It isn't the explosion, nor the gunshot, it is the second of silence that follows, that half-second void where the whole world seems to hold its breath before deciding what comes next. That silence holds every question a man has never dared to ask himself, and in that silence, on the day that changed my eternity, I heard the answer to all the questions I had avoided for 42 years of my life. My name is Andres Solano. I was a soldier for 19 years. I survived 3 missions in conflict zones, 2 roadside blasts, and more situations than I can list without my voice trembling. I took pride in that. It defined me. I believed that a man who had stared death in the face so many times and remained standing was a man with nothing left to fear. I was wrong in a way for which I have no words. What I am about to tell you happened on the 17th day of my final mission. I won't name the exact location, because that isn't what matters. What matters is what lay on that ground, the dust of centuries, hatred accumulated over generations, and the certainty, shared by men on both sides, that our cause was the just one. That certainty, that conviction, so pure and so blind, allowed us to march toward danger with our heads held high. It was the very same certainty that stayed with me until the moment it ceased to matter at all. That morning, the air smelled of something unknown to those who have never seen combat, the scent of a land that has been a theater of death for far too long. It isn't a smell that can be broken down into its component parts. It is a sum, an accumulation, something that seeps into your clothes, your lungs, and somewhere even deeper than your lungs. We advanced in formation through a sector that, on the map, appeared clear. Maps lie, or rather, maps only show what can be measured, and there are things in war that don't appear on any map. I saw Ramiro to my left. We had been on 4 missions together. I knew the way he breathed when he was afraid, and he knew mine. We had developed that silent language that exists only between people who have relied on each other's ability to react in split seconds. At that moment, he looked at me and gave a slight nod, that gesture which, among soldiers, means I'm here, I've got your back. We moved on. That was the last I saw of him before the world split in 2. I don't remember the blast wave as a sound. I remember it as pressure, a pressure that instantly consumed everything. The air, the ground, the inside of my chest, as if the entire universe had decided to compress itself into a single point, exactly where I was standing, and then the ground was gone, and the sky was where the ground should have been, and my body was doing something bodies aren't supposed to do. I knew it with that strange, clinical clarity with which the mind sometimes processes its own catastrophe. I landed. I didn't feel the impact. That should have told me something. When you fall in combat and don't feel the impact, it isn't because God has protected you, it's because the circuit connecting body and consciousness has already been severed. I was on the ground. The dust was so close to my face that I could see every grain individually with an almost hallucinatory clarity. I heard voices reaching me, distorted. The name I was given at birth, spoken with an urgency I'd recognize in any language. Ramiro, Ramiro, being shouted, and then, something happened that no training, no mission, and no 19 years of experience in war zones had prepared me to face. I was no longer inside my body, just like that, without warning, without transition, without the gentleness one might imagine for such a moment. I was simply inside, and then I was outside, and what followed was the most brutal war one have ever fought, the only one that truly mattered, waged not on some Middle Eastern battlefield, but within the depths of my own soul. The first thing I noticed was that the pain was gone, just like that, suddenly, without transition, without any gradual fading. It simply vanished, the way a light goes out. In its place was a strange kind of clarity, a lucidity I had never experienced while alive, as if all the filters the brain normally places between reality and perception had been stripped away in a single instant. Then I realized I was hovering above, not very high, perhaps 3 or 4 meters off the ground, floating in a position that, in the normal world, would have been impossible and terrifying. Yet I felt no immediate fear, only confusion, a deep, almost serene confusion, like someone waking up in an unfamiliar place and taking a few seconds to get their bearings. I looked down and saw myself. I was lying on the ground, exactly where I remembered being. My body, my uniform, my gear, everything was the same, except that I was no longer inside that body. I was looking at it from the outside with the same neutrality one feels when gazing at an object one owns but isn't using at the moment. Ramiro was kneeling beside me, applying pressure with both hands, shouting something to someone over the radio. His voice came through distorted, as if heard through water. Two other colleagues approached. I watched their movements with strange clarity, as if time had shifted gears, as if I could see them in slow motion while simultaneously understanding perfectly what was happening. One of them took my wrist, searching for a pulse. The look on his face when he didn't find one is something I will never forget. That expression said it all without a word being spoken. I tried to speak to them. I shouted, or at least, I felt like I was shouting, "I'm here, I'm right here, I'm okay," but my words made no sound in that world. It was like screaming behind thick glass, seeing lips move, feeling the strain of the shout, yet producing absolutely nothing audible. That sense of helplessness was the first form of terror I experienced in that state. Ramiro began to cry. It wasn't the quiet weeping of someone trying to maintain their composure. It was the kind of sobbing that erupts from the center of the chest of a man who has seen too much and can no longer hold anything back. I saw him cover his face with his hands, those hands that, just moments before, has been trying to keep me alive, and something in me wanted to comfort him, wanted to tell him it was all right, not to worry, but I couldn't reach him. I began to move through the space in a way I didn't fully control, as if a gentle current were carrying me. I drifted away from the spot, floating over the ruined landscape, over the rubble and the dust, and in that moment, I began to wait. I waited for the light. I waited for the angels, waited for that sense of peace that everyone who reads books about near-death experiences describes as the first thing one feels. I waited for all of that. Nothing came. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of something absent, like walking into a room where someone important had been and realizing, from the temperature of the air or the way things were arranged, that the person had left long ago and there was no sign they were coming back. That kind of silence, the kind that seeps into your pores. I wasn't a man who had lived apart from God, or at least, that's what I believed. I had grown up in a family of believers. I had prayed before every mission. I carried a small Bible in the inner pocket of my vest, the very one my mother had placed in my hands the day I said goodbye to her at the airport. I believed with genuine conviction that if something happened to me, God would be there, that the worst thing that could happen to me in death was meeting him. But there was no one there, and that was more terrifying than anything combat had taught me to fear. I remained suspended in that in-between space for what felt like a long time. Though time doesn't work the way it does here, there are no clocks, no sun moving across the sky, no hunger or thirst to mark the passing hours. There is only presence or absence, and in that place, there was only absence, an absence that weighed heavy, that had texture, that clung to me like wet clothes that could not be removed. I tried to pray. I tried to recall the words I had spoken thousands of times, the ones my mother taught me as a child, the ones I recited before sleep with an automaticity I never questioned, but the words came out empty, like seedless husks, not because I failed to speak them, but because something in that place absorbed them before they could reach anywhere, like shouting in a room with no echo. And then, something unexpected began to emerge, guilt, not as an organized thought, but as a physical sensation, a pressure in the center of my chest that grew slowly. Images began to appear, not chaotically, but with a cruel, selective clarity, conversations I had avoided, decisions I had made knowing they were wrong, moments when I could have been compassionate but chose to be cold, moments when I could have told the truth but chose to protect my image. The image I held of myself began to crack. For years, I had seen myself as someone fundamentally good, someone who served his country, honored his family, and fulfilled his religious obligations. But in that silence, something began to reveal the cracks in that image. the parts I had never wanted to examine closely, the arrogance with which I treated those who, considered inferior to me, the contempt disguised as discipline, the coldness disguised as strength, and then, as if that thought had been a signal, the ground beneath me began to change, or rather, I began to feel that there was no longer any ground, that what held me up was receding, that something below, far below, was beginning to claim me. The fall was not immediate, it was gradual, like sinking into something thick, something that resisted movement yet simultaneously dragged you down with no possibility of stopping. The air changed. In the space above, there had been something resembling air, neutral, temperatureless, but the air I began to descend into was different. It had weight, it had temperature, it had a scent. The scent came first. It is difficult to describe precisely because nothing in the living world smells exactly like that. It was a combination of burning, rot, and something metallic and sour that penetrated not just my nose but somewhere deeper, as if the odor had a will of its own and chose where to take hold. That scent told me, before any sight or sound, that I was descending towards something malevolent. Then came the sounds. At first, they were distant, like hearing something through several thick walls, a low, steady hum, almost mechanical, and, intermittently layered over that hum, something I was slow to identify because my mind refused to recognize it. They were voices, many voices, not speaking, but making sounds that transcended language, transcended wailing or weeping, sounds of an anguish that has no name in any human tongue. The darkness surrounding me was not like the darkness of a room without light. It was not merely the absence of illumination, it was an active, dense darkness that clung to my skin like a fluid, exerting pressure, shifting and moving. There were moments when shapes seemed to emerge from that darkness, shadows darker than the darkness itself, drifting alongside my descent without ever fully approaching, as if sizing me up. I kept falling. I cannot tell you how long it lasted, for the concept loses all meaning. I only know it was long enough for the panic I initially felt to transform into something else, something colder. Resignation isn't the right word, it was more like the state of mind one enters upon realizing that control over events is impossible and the only option left is to experience them. An involuntary surrender. Heat began to rise from below, not the heat of the sun, which is open and expansive. This heat surged upward like that of a furnace, concentrated, dense, and, curiously, it cast no light. Fire in the world of the living always gives light. That was one of the things that deeply disturbed me later. Once I could think more clearly, down there, flames existed, yet they cast no illumination. They burned without revealing, they radiated heat without offering hope. The shadows flanking my descent began to take on more defined shapes, neither animal nor fully human. They were something in between, something that used recognizable silhouettes to evoke the utmost unease. At one point, two of them drew closer, not to attack, but simply to accompany my descent like uninvited escorts. Their presence was enough to make something deep within me, whatever constituted the core of my being in that state, begin to contract in fear. When I finally reached the bottom, it wasn't a violent impact, it was more like hitting the floor of a swimming pool, that gradual resistance that halts movement. My feet, or whatever my feet were in that state, touched something solid, yet feeling like a living surface. I looked up at my surroundings, and what I saw made me realize that the fear I had felt until then was merely a prelude. The place was vast, too vast for the mind to hold without shattering. It wasn't a cavern, though it had dark rock ceilings that vanished into impossible heights. It wasn't a valley, though the terrain rose and fell. It was something that encompassed all that and more, as if space itself had been designed to induce simultaneous disorientation and horror. A place built with an intelligence, an architecture, that was, in itself, a form of torture. The light, or whatever served as light, came from flames, but as I told you, those flames didn't illuminate in the normal way. They created a strange, reddish, fragmented visibility, enough to comprehend, but not enough to fully process. It was the calculated visibility of horror, just the right amount of clarity to make the suffering visible, leaving the mind no way to shield itself by looking away. Sectors, that is the word that best describes it. The place was divided into sectors that corresponded to something, though it took me a while to fully grasp what. There were zones where souls stood motionless, as if trapped in a transparency that wasn't solid, yet yielded to no effort. Other zones saw continuous movement, circular, directionless, purposeless, like caged animals that had long since forgotten what it meant to walk toward a destination. The ground beneath my feet, that surface which felt alive, had a temperature, not uniformly hot, but variable, as if different parts of the terrain held different intensities. With some steps, the heat was tolerable; with others, it would suddenly spike to a level that would have been unbearable for a physical body, and between one step and the next, that variation created a constant anxiety, because you never knew what the next step would bring. The souls I saw were neither misty specters nor fully human figures. They possessed a real, defined presence, with recognizable features and expressions. That was what was most unsettling. Their faces were fully expressive. There was no uniformity of suffering. There was anger, confusion, and a kind of serene madness that was more terrifying than screaming or weeping. And there was something in the eyes of many of them, something hardest of all to bear: recognition. They knew where they were, and they knew why. I recognized someone. I won't say the name, because that person has living family and I have no right to impose that burden. But I recognized someone who had been a spiritual authority figure in my community when I was a child, someone whose voice from the pulpit had shaped my understanding of God for years. He was there, and when our eyes met, I saw an expression in his gaze that stopped me dead in my tracks. It wasn't shame, it was something that took me a while to identify. It was the realization that everything he had preached was true, and that the truth had found him exactly where he had told others they shouldn't go. I approached him, driven by an uncontrollable instinct. I wanted to ask him how. I wanted to understand, but before I could formulate a thought, before I could articulate a single thing, a presence stepped between us. It didn't arrive by walking or descending from above. It simply appeared, as naturally as a shadow emerges when a cloud covers the sun, and it was the cold that heralded its arrival, a cold not of temperature, but of something more essential, something harder to name, the cold of something utterly devoid of what life needs to sustain itself. It didn't scream. That was the first thing about it that unsettled me. Who didn't shout, didn't roar, didn't emit animal sounds, nor produce any of the effects I would have expected from an entity of that place. He spoke with a voice that was almost academic in its precision, almost clinical in its control. A voice that sounded like that of someone who has all their documents in order and knows exactly what they are talking about. He told me my name, my full name, not the nom de guerre I used on missions, not the nickname my comrades had given me, my real name, the one on my ID card, the one my father spoke when he registered my birth. That name in his mouth was like a signature on a contract I didn't remember signing, yet one that apparently existed. He began with the war, not with the obvious crimes, not with the deaths in combat, because he quickly understood that I could justify those. He started with the small things. The way I looked at the civilians of that land, not as people, but as variables on a tactical map. The indifference with which I walked past human misery, provided that misery wasn't part of my immediate mission. The contempt I felt, and never examined, for those who were different from me. Then he moved on to my life before the war. He spoke of my relationship with my father, of how I always harbored a grudge against him for things I never directly expressed, and how that grudge turned into a hardness I extended toward any man in a position to tell me something I didn't want to hear. He spoke of how I used religion not as a genuine relationship, but as a social shield, as a way to appear to others as someone who didn't need to be questioned. He spoke of pride. Not the obvious kind, not the sort that makes you fight or publicly humiliate someone, but the subtle kind, the pride that renders you incapable of asking for forgiveness, even when you know you owe it, the kind that makes you listen to someone share their pain while you think about your reply, instead of truly listening. It is the life that leaves you respected by others, yet without you ever having earned the right to that most intimate respect. The kind you grant yourself only when you are completely honest. He spoke without pause, without emotion, without apparent cruelty, and that made it more devastating than if he had shouted. Everything he said carried the weight of truth, and I, who wanted to contradict him, who wanted to find a flaw in his argument, could not, because everything he said was true, not the truth I would have chosen to tell about myself, but the truth nonetheless. Then he pointed toward the distance, toward a region that, from where we stood, seemed darker than the rest, denser, quieter, in a way that was worse than screaming. He explained what awaited me there with the same calm a doctor uses to explain a diagnosis, devoid of any apparent satisfaction. Even though I could sense the satisfaction radiating from that entity, much like feeling the heat of a source without seeing it, it described to me an eternity of what I feared most: absolute isolation, consciousness without connection, knowing without the power to change a thing. And in that moment, something inside me broke, not dramatically, not with a scream or a collapse, but with the quiet, terrible stillness of someone who has just realized they have lost something irretrievable. I stood motionless as that realization settled into me, the way water soaks into wood. The being beside me began to move, guiding me toward that darker region, and I followed because I no longer believed I had a choice. I do not know where the impulse came from. It was not an orderly thought, nor a decision made after weighing my options. It was something that predated thought, something emerging from the deepest part of my being, deeper than my identity as a soldier, deeper than my religious history, deeper even than my name. Something that existed before all of it and was, at that moment, the only thing left. I tried to speak the name of Jesus. At first, it wouldn't come out, not because I didn't know it, but because something in that place exerted pressure against the ability to utter it, like trying to speak underwater or scream with one's chest crushed by an invisible weight. I felt the place's physical resistance to that name, and that very resistance told me something important. The name held power there, precisely because everything in that environment opposed it. I tried again, and this time it came out, though barely. It was a whisper that scarcely took shape, possessing barely enough strength to exist as sound in that space, yet it emerged, and the moment it did, the entity beside me stopped. It didn't turn around immediately, it simply stopped, and that pause was the first sign that something was changing, that the rules governing the last few moments were not the only rules that existed. I said it again, this time with more force, this time from a place of honesty I hadn't consciously accessed before. It wasn't the religious pronunciation of the name, it wasn't the repetition of someone who had learned that the name holds power and uses it like a formula. It was the cry of someone with nothing left, someone who had lost all self-justification, who could no longer maintain any image of themselves, and who, in that state of absolute stripping away, reached out toward the only thing remaining, not because I deserved to be rescued, but because I couldn't help but do it. The effect wasn't gradual. The darkness, so dense, so physical, so oppressive, began to recede, not all at once, but like when a heavy curtain is drawn back and the light enters as a sliver before flooding the entire space. There was something about that receding darkness that felt like a defeat, and I could sense it the way one feels a change in air pressure when a door opens. The accusing entity let out a sound, not a scream, but something worse than a scream, a sound of rage that was also a sound of powerlessness, and those two things combined in a single sound were unlike anything I had ever heard before. The light that arrived wasn't sunlight, it was a light that possessed a moral quality, if that makes any sense. It was a light that didn't merely illuminate but revealed, making the terror of that previous place visible in perspective, like turning on a light in a room and seeing how much dust had unknowingly accumulated. That light came from above, moving with purpose and direction, and preceding it came something I can only describe as an authority that made everything else in that place seem small. They came for me. I don't say this with the calm of someone who has processed it all. I say it with the same disbelief I felt in that moment. They came for me, not because I deserved it. That was made completely clear in everything that followed. They came for me because someone with authority over that place had decided my story didn't end there, that there was something I had to do with what I had seen, that the testimony of my experience served a purpose I hadn't chosen but couldn't refuse, either. I rose. The pressure, of the heat. The stench, the sheer density of that place, began to subside as I moved away, and that gradual easing was, in itself, a revelation. Everything I had accepted as normal down there was actually oppression. Only when it began to lift did I realize how much weight I had been carrying. I won't describe in detail what I found above. Some things defy words that are both precise and just. What I can tell you is that the presence welcoming me was so unlike anything I had experienced below that the contrast itself conveyed meaning, like stepping from the harshest winter into a temperature that wasn't merely warmth, but a welcome. Not peace defined as the absence of conflict, but peace defined as the presence of something that should have been there all along. There was a moment of confrontation, not one of terror, but something more complex. I was shown the things the accuser had pointed out, yet from a different perspective, not with the coldness of accusation, but with something simultaneously more severe and more compassionate than anything I had ever known. It was like looking at photos that reveal something shameful, but seeing them through the eyes of someone who knows you completely, and who, despite knowing you fully, has not chosen to abandon you. It was clearly explained to me where I had failed, not the sins anyone could point out from the outside, the ones I knew about but always found a reason to avoid examining, the hardening of heart I mistook for strength, the pride I guarded by calling it dignity, the unforgiveness I never resolved because it was more comfortable to cling to the narrative of being the aggrieved party, the spiritual rigidity of someone who holds the outward forms of faith but has lost its substance. Accepting this was the hardest part, not because it was violent, but because it was true, and receiving the truth about oneself, without defenses, without the possibility of self-justification or seeking context to mitigate responsibility, is one of the sharpest pains there is. There is no pain quite like seeing clearly what you once were and knowing exactly what it cost. Then came the mission, not chosen by me, not negotiated, delivered with the firmness of something beyond debate, yet requiring no coercion, for once you have seen what I saw, the motivation to obey stems not from fear, but from something else entirely. I was told I had to return, to live differently, to speak of this, even if no one believed me, even if it were uncomfortable, even if it cost me credibility in the places where it mattered most. The return was violent, not in the sense of physical harm inflicted by another, but in the sense that re-entering a physical body after having existed without one is an experience that language struggles to convey. Suddenly, there was weight, temperature, texture, pain. The pain that had vanished completely when I left my body came rushing back, magnified, along with the sounds of the physical world, monitors, medical voices, and the weeping of someone I couldn't identify in that first moment of return. It was my mother. I don't know how she got there, I don't know how much time had passed in the world of the living, but it was her hand holding mine, and her voice speaking my name with that blend of pleading and gratitude that only those who truly love can convey. I opened my eyes, and the first thing I saw was her face. The first thing I did was weep, not from physical pain, but from something that needed to break free from deep within, something that had been trapped for far too long. The months that followed were the hardest chapter of my life, and I have lived through war. I had to reconstruct conversations I had avoided for years. I had to seek out my father with the truth in hand, rather than the silence I was accustomed to. I had to let go of the pride that had defined my identity for so long, pride so deeply ingrained that I could no longer tell where it ended and I began. At 42, I had to learn that being strong doesn't mean being impenetrable, that serving others doesn't exempt you from accountability, and that carrying a Bible in your pocket isn't the same as carrying its message in your heart. If you've made it this far, I want you to know something. I'm not sharing this to impress you or to ask for blind belief. I'm sharing it because someone else needs to hear it, because I know that among those listening now, there are people who, just as I once did, live behind a carefully constructed image. People who know the vocabulary of faith but lost touch long ago with what lies beneath those words. What I saw wasn't a morphine hallucination or the product of a brain fighting to survive. What I saw was real, with a reality that makes everything we consider real here seem merely provisional. And what I learned is that the question that matters most isn't how right you appear to others, but how honest you are about who you truly are when no one is watching. I am not asking you to change your lives based on my word. I am asking you to do something smaller and harder, to be honest with yourselves right now, to ask yourselves what lies within you that you have not yet examined, to not wait for life to take you, as it took me, to the one place where it is no longer possible to keep avoiding that question. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for listening to the very end, to something that was not easy to tell, and which I imagine was not easy to hear. My story continues. There are things I saw in that place that I have not yet been able to fully articulate, things about the regions of hell that were visited, about the souls I recognized, and about what Jesus showed me regarding what is coming for this world in the time that lies beyond our sight. If you wish to keep listening, I will be here. Deus Enzo.